And good afternoon. Charles Moscowitz here, and I'm welcoming John Klyczek to this segment of the program. John is the author of School World Order, the Technocratic Globalization of Corporatized Education. He has an MA in English. He's taught college rhetoric and research augmentation for over 7 years. His literary scholarship concentrates on the history of global eugenics and Aldous Huxley's dystopic novel, Brave New World. John, thanks for joining me this afternoon.
Thanks for having me, Chuck. I really appreciate it.
Well, your book is very timely right now, given the fact that we're all involved in this medically induced martial law, and people are afraid to go outside, so they're beginning to homeschool their children and look to cyber means to do that. So talk about what you mean by this technocratic educational modality, and how does it relate to eugenics, the pre-World War II eugenics?
Okay. So the technocratic aspect of it involves three aspects. It's basically conditioning students' brains, conditioning students' emotions, and then there's also something called precision education, which is going to provide personalized learning based on the student's DNA. So it's basically conditioning the mind, the emotion, and then the DNA.
The biology.
Yeah, the biology, right? You could put an analog, to ethos, logos, pathos, mind, emotion, and will or character too. So I just find that interesting as a rhetoric person myself. So the closest part, the cell part, which is SEL, it's socio-emotional learning. That has a eugenics component because of something that they called mental hygiene. Right? There was race hygiene, and then there was mental hygiene. And the race hygiene had largely to do with, your ethnicity, your ethnic genes, right? And so they like to target, Black people, Jewish people, Eastern European people, okay, and just because of their DNA, right, their ethnic heredity. But then there was also the IQ component, and that would have been the mental health component. And so, if your IQ, regardless of your ethnicity, was below, I believe, 80, they'd have terms like moron, idiot, imbecile. These were like medical terms at the time.
Oh, yeah, sure.
And those would determine whether or not you got sterilized or, segregated into a home for the feeble-minded, or, both, or, something like that. And so the IQ part, which also goes with the precision ed, because that's what they want to look at. They want to look at how your IQ is genetic. And so in that way, it's basically largely based on bell curve stuff. It's and if you look at those statistics, they basically come out of the old eugenics statistics. They're largely based on a lot of data that came from tests they did on people in World War I, the soldiers in World War I, and a lot of that data got picked up by there's a big important book in Germany. It was it's by Irvin Bauer, Eugen Fischer, and Fritz Lenz, and that is Human Heredity, and that kind of became this tome that people like Madison Grant in America picked up and then started to use it to basically industrialize the process, and that became funded by Rockefeller Foundation, and they basically had mass sterilization projects that essentially took a culmination in concentration camp stuff in Nazi Germany and stuff like that. But so they basically are using those same data, those same metrics, and especially when you look at the ethnic components to it, they want to as far as the range of who averages that bell curve, who averages 100 and higher based on their ethnicity. It's the same categories that they had. It's not very different. The only difference now is that they're gonna use artificial intelligence to tell you that their algorithms are much more precise than Mendel's little Punnett squares and those little tree diagrams that they had. That's what they're essentially doing. If you ask me, it's essentially the same stuff with maybe some more sophisticated algorithms. Go ahead.
If I could interject, they're further scientizing this bogus pseudoscience that was all the rage and very much out in the open before World War II, when it became unfashionable. And it was very much a part of the so-called progressive movement. Darwin's cousin, Francis Galton, was sort of the founder of modern eugenics, and he worked very closely with Darwin. They believed that different human beings some were more evolved than others, and some groups were more involved than others. And Darwin's son became the head of the International Eugenics Society. And this was all part of the progressive movement right up to World War II. And it was very, coached and wrapped in the cloak of science. It was very much the idea that some people are more evolved than others. It's completely in sync with the theory of evolution. In fact, you make reference to imbeciles and idiots being sent off and sterilized. That was a Supreme Court decision in 1925, Buck versus Bell, written by Supreme Court Chief Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, which condemned this girl to be sterilized because she was too promiscuous, basically. And these became seen as part of the great progressive move in many states. I mean, you mentioned Davenport and others. These people were funded by the Rockefeller Institute. This was like Margaret Sanger, she talked about useful idiots and useless eaters, and she had as a guest on her newsletter Fritz Rudin, who was a Nazi eugenicist, and they were all celebrating this idea. Of course, it went out of fashion after World War II because of the Nazi Holocaust, but it still was around. You still had Julian Huxley, the head of the UNESCO, the founding head of UNESCO, who was, of course, a cousin to Aldous Huxley, brother, I think, of Aldous Huxley, Brave New World, which you base your book on, who talked about how to bring back, eugenics under a new name. And he developed this idea of, a new religion that would replace all the world's religions, and it would be based on his pseudoscience. They'd leave in place all of the images of the religions of the world. You'd still have the priest and the incense and the marriages and the rituals, but the meaning, the concept, the philosophy would be gradually replaced by this new international evolutionary eugenics. And that's basically what they've been trying to do ever since. Now, what you're talking about is interesting to me because it brings it up to today. And they're trying to use algorithms and data that they're gathering in these increasingly complex computer data centers on every little aspect of the individual's life. I mean, starting from the minute you went to school, and they're trying to put together these profiles of students. They want to know like what your teeth are like. I mean, they want to know everything about you right when you enter kindergarten now. And they're putting it all in this database, and they're also going to eventually get a hold of your genomic map. And I'm not against genomic mapping. I think that it has a role because it can help you find out if you have any predisposition to a disease, but it should be private. It should be proprietary. It's like owning property. They're entering this stuff into databases, and they're going to be able to determine your future once they get this stuff together. They'll decide whether or not you're allowed to get married, because maybe you're seen as too stupid or too something, not politically correct, whatever, and that you won't get a license. I'm just saying. And this whole pandemic thing reeks of that. You're going to have a certificate to leave the house. It's very, very suspicious to me. Anyway, John, continue.
Well, yeah, you did a good job of condensing a lot of good history there to emphasize it and to tie it back into the mind. We could jump to something called transhumanism. I know you've talked about that in some of your shows before.
Oh, yes. Good topic.
And in Brave New World, the first several chapters, I teach it, and the first several chapters are what I like to call world building. Right? Huxley is he's demonstrating how this new world works before he gets into character development and the actual plot line. In the first chapter, he's showing you all about the eugenics. It's all about the biological conditioning, the biological engineering. But in the second chapter, it's all about the behaviorist conditioning, the psychological conditioning, and they're in the neo-Pavlovian conditioning centers, and it's all about, what later becomes operant conditioning. Well, so for Huxley, see, we usually think of eugenics as, right, the science of heredity, the proto-genetics, but largely it was isolated to the field of biology. But if you look at the big eugenics tree that they posted at the International Eugenics Congress, the first one or the second one, if you look at the roots to the tree, in the middle it says something like eugenics draws from the root from the branches or from the roots of many other sciences and builds one tree. And if you look at the roots, it's everything from psychology to law to history to sociology, anthropology, right? It's essentially, this scientific synthesis of empirically of all these different fields to engineer the new man or the new person. So there always was actually an undercurrent where it wasn't nature versus nurture. It wasn't always, although they would specialize, it wasn't the eugenic biologist versus, the behavioral psychologist. They synthesized in something later that's called basically transhumanism. And Huxley's basically showing you that in Brave New World. And what this means is that they're going to combine both the genetic conditioning with the behaviorist conditioning, and that essentially becomes the new science, the new neuroscience, which is essentially transhumanism. And in my book, I have several documents that show everything from monkeys that can control robots with their brains. You can go back to Jose Delgado, Manuel Rodriguez Delgado at Yale. He had the first neural implants, and it was either the late 50s or 60s or 70s, 60s. And so that this stuff is almost 40 years old, but what it's doing is combining both of those sciences. And that's essentially what the new education system is going to do. It's going to merge with mental health, which is the behavioral sciences, and also with biological medicine, which is the DNA part. And there's also going to be a criminal justice component into it. Okay, and so they're going to use these algorithms to not only predetermine what career pathways, what they call it, what career path curriculum you're supposed to learn, but also whether or not your behavioral algorithms, maybe you need some behavioral interventions, juvenile pre-crime justice or something like that. And so all of that's going to get merged into something that we could call a social credit system. And if you look over in China,
they're already doing it.
It was an ABC report. If you want, to talk about it and to read about it is one thing, but
let's just touch on that briefly. China already is implementing this social rating system where every single person who carries a phone has a score. And if you don't have a high score, you don't get any benefits. You got leave. You have it's all rated. And that's being handled. I think it's being developed by Google, which is completely sold out to China. And they're going to do it here. Why would we think they wouldn't? They were already talking about developing a means by which they can detect people who have had COVID-19, and then the little bell goes off if you go near someone. That's the technology that could be used for just about anything. Now, John, you I don't know if you know who Jim Keith is, the author of Mind Control, World Control. A lot of the things you're talking about remind me of the late Jim Keith, who, by the way, died under very mysterious circumstances. He was a relatively young man. I had the honor of interviewing him before that happened. And his book gets into the whole business of the experiments with Delgado and all of the kind of the MK Ultra and Monarch and all the CIA type experiments that were being done right after World War II, and how this whole so-called scientific movement began. You also talk about transhumanism, which is big over here near where I live at MIT, and its connections to Jeffrey Epstein are very scandalous. But the head professor at the Media Lab, whose name escapes me right now, who had to resign under very dark circumstances, the website and his letters and his writing is still up there at MIT. Just look up transhumanism, MIT. I'm pretty sure it's still up there. At least it was up there last time I looked. Maybe not today, but it gets into this whole transhumanism agenda, this idea of creating this new man. It's a new neo-evolution that it's going to include a human being who has computer components, who develops super consciousness, super health. You could live to be 200. All that stuff sounds good on paper, and maybe some of it might be beneficial, but they have an agenda with that. That's it's very much like the Ubermensch. It's kind of like the creation of a superior species that will pop out of the human species, a new species based entirely on Darwin.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and like I said, that it's so almost it's at least almost 50 years old, right? I mean, for people that are listening and think that this sounds crazy or science fiction, it's old hat. It's not anything new. And you can look at, what is it, Annie Jacobson's book on all the DARPA stuff they've done with, they call them brain computer interfaces. Elon Musk says that you can go on and see his prototype. He shows you the chip. He shows you the robot that inserts it in you. He explains that it hooks to an app on your phone. I used to joke with my students and say, one day you guys are going to plug that phone in your head. And I was being facetious, but literally the app goes to the phone. So I mean, in a sense, the app is plugging straight into their heads. But he says that you're going to be able to buy that commercially by the end of this year. So now take that and plug it into the social credit system. We should add that it's not just necessarily tracking your phone and your social media stuff, your digital posts, but it also in China, they have facial recognition cameras everywhere. So it's also tracking your real-time behavior. If you go in the store and you grab, let's say you buy too much beer, as you put it in your cart, because it's tracking your face, not when you buy it. When you put it in your cart, it's taking your score down, right? And if you put some diapers in there, maybe it goes back up or something like that. But if we take this chip, right, and we by the way, I need to say that I always forget to say this when I do this. This is important. We know that one of the things that they keep saying is we're not going to go back to normal until we have to get a vaccine, until we have a vaccine. Essentially what they're going for is they're trying to force you to get a vaccine. If they can force you to put something in your body for the sake of public health, whether it be a vaccine or otherwise, they have set the precedent where they can force you to have a chip for the sake of public health. Once they can invade your body, once you don't, I mean, we've already, the privacy of our homes and public spheres, that's eroded for a long time now. Now they want the last frontier, which is they want the right to go in your body. And if they get that, you know what I mean? It's going to be very,
it's over.
Very,
it's
yeah, I mean, I hate to say it like that, but it'll certainly be very
mark
difficult.
Of the beast.
Yes, man.
It's the mark of the You'll have to be able to get a credit approval from this chip inside of you before you buy a pack of gum. I mean, it is the mark of the beast. There'll be complete control. And right now, what we're living through with this lockdown is an experiment, I think, in how much they can control people internationally. It is completely unnecessary, I believe, because I think that the coronavirus can be treated like any other disease. It can be treated with medicine. If you have it, you get medicine, whether it be hydrochloroquine or something else. I think they're very close to that, and you get cured. You don't have to lock down the entire country over this. People die from diseases all the time, and it's a crisis. I'm not saying it isn't, and I'm not going to run around outside either. I mean, it's a terrible disease. But the point is that it's the response to it has not been. It's just very suspicious to me. It just looks very much like in sort of hands of glove what you're talking about, John. This kind of new world order eugenics program.
Yeah, and I mean, it's some people worry like, to go way out there. Some people are like, well, they'll have something in it. The vaccine will have the chip already. You can look at like Bill Gates'
I've heard that.
ID 2020.
Who knows? I've heard
but
that.
It doesn't have to be. All they have, like I said, all they have to do is get you used to them putting stuff in you, and it can just be a matter of time until they acclimate you. Okay, because another part of this is conditioning. Okay, the behaviorist method is not just. They don't just use it through the adaptive learning software in the schools. They use it in business. They use it in government. And it's something called shaping. So they move you incrementally. They get you used to smaller adjustments. So instead of just going, you take the chip first, it's just a vaccine, right? And then it moves.
Just a vaccine.
And so, and so I just had to toss that because, I think that's, if people haven't thought of that, from a legal perspective, in terms of setting precedent, that has to be acknowledged. And so, back to the social credit thing, if you have a chip, then you're essentially they can triangulate you anywhere all the time, right? I mean, there's no way to, maybe leave your phone at home or, and people did this in China, and then their neighbors would rat them out and things like that. They're
Well,
trying
China,
to,
I mean, it's interesting also, now that you bring up China, being a communist country, they have a system of like block observers, people who, so-called social workers, who keep an eye on what goes on in their block. The Nazis did this too, where they listen in on conversation, people snitch on their neighbors. And if you have, like, for example, a woman who's pregnant beyond the number of children the government allows her to have, might get a knock on the door and they'll drag her out and have a forced abortion. I mean, I don't know if that's happening right now, but it probably is. But I'm just saying that this is like complete top to bottom social control over people. And that is with a person, never mind technological, which is now, they don't even need a block manager. They now get these apps that can do it automatically almost.
Yeah, and one of the things that one of the more sinister aspects was that Delgado, what he played with was, if you ever, and if you, I have it over here on the shelf, it's physical control of the mind. And he's got pictures in there of when he was practicing on trying to treat mental patients with these very crude electrodes. And, they found that, especially at the amygdala, the limbic system, you could stimulate certain emotions. You could fear, anger, excitement, and things. And what I found was interesting was they would put in there, somebody would be taking notes, and the person would be saying things like, "Don't make me do this." They would get aggressive, and they wouldn't. What was interesting, they learned that they wouldn't lash out at authority. That they would find something else to lash onto, but they would be saying things like, "Don't make me do." They knew that something was, compelling them, and they still had a part of their conscious mind that was separate from that. I think that's interesting. But the point is that he thought that you could basically control riots. Especially he thought inner city people were especially dangerous. He thought you could control civil unrests, inner city riots, and things with a beam that could essentially hit that spot in your amygdala and either calm you down if you're too excited. And with the 5G triangulation, what it does is it's going to, they can spot when you look at your GPS, your location now, it's a lot more precise. Okay. And so, if you had a chip or something like that, they could essentially do that, right? I mean, it's basically, they could do the same thing they did in those isolated experiments. If you have to wear Neuralink, Elon Musk's Neuralink, okay,
Yeah,
and
and believe it or not,
Facebook's building them as well, and so is Microsoft.
We you and I and most people right now would completely and utterly reject the idea of having a chip implanted, but just wait. I think we are being conditioned to accept it, and also vaccines are no solution even without a chip. I don't know if they can have a chip in it or not. I have no idea. I doubt it, but whatever. The point is that. I mean, my friend Ian Trottier, the radio host in Miami, was just on with me, and he pointed out that in the 70s, when they had the swine flu epidemic, they developed a vaccine for that, and President Ford backed it. I think he had even one of his children have it. It's okay, it's safe. Thousands of people died from that vaccine. It was a disaster, and even 60 Minutes did a piece on it in 1978. So. A vaccine is not necessarily such a wonderful idea. I'm not against vaccines per se, although I tend to be very careful about that. But you have to approach these things with a great deal of trepidation, especially if they're rushing it into production.
Yeah, I mean, I got the polio vaccine and stuff like that. I mean, I don't get the flu vaccine. I don't see the need for it.
Neither do I. No, I mean, I've had only the essentials. But I'm not against it per se. Although I think there's some things about it. They don't, some of the stuff they put in there with it is not healthy, like formaldehyde.
Well, now they want to fast track them. But at the end of the day, what I am ultimately arguing for is the right to choose what is healthy for my body. And
that's right. I mean, the idea of the government telling someone they have to inject something into their body, that should be abhorrent to anybody. I get they might want to encourage it, fine, but to actually force people to have a needle stuck into their arms, no, that's.
it defies logic because, I know they use the herd immunity thing, but if it causally does what you say it does, which is protect you from getting it and from spreading it, then all of those people who have it don't have to worry about the people who don't have it, right? And so,
Right.
I know they try to use this herd immunity argument as the rebuttal to that, but I'm sorry, that doesn't refute the basic. It's a tautology to me. Like either it works or it
Mm-hmm.
doesn't. If you got it, it does, and if you don't have to worry about it. So, you know, but at the end of the day, what we're talking about is, the right to choose what is healthy for you. And yes, you should be, mindful of other people and stuff like that. But, you should also be mindful of the people that don't want to be. That works both ways, golden rule, right? So,
Yep. Yep. All right. So my guest is John. Let me get back to the subject. John Klyczek is my guest. The book is School World Order. It's available at Amazon.com. It's available at Trine Day Books. So, John, let's get back, as you say, to the subject of education, and just bring us sort of up to date, because I think that the education system, starting really in the 1930s, but really accelerating in the 60s, the cognitive education system, which taught someone how to think on their own, how to be an independent thinker, how to have the basic tools to then be an independent person, it's been replaced largely by behaviorism and by things like look-say reading, which is creating dyslexia and other things in young people, and other modalities that have really damaged young people's brains. I mean, my good friend, the late Dr. Samuel Blumenfeld, wrote about this extensively, and he was one of the fathers of homeschooling. What do you have on that? I mean, what kind of data do you have on the development of so-called progressive education, and what kind of effects has that had on young people who are now adults in many cases?
So there's two components we should flush out. There's a philosophical component, and then there's a methodological component. You touched on the methodological component, which is replacing the classical methodology with the stimulus response behavioral psychological method. And actually, it does tie into the look-say methodology, because instead of analyzing the logic of a word based on its phonics and the meanings of its morphemes, root, suffix, prefix, and how those sounds have meaning, how they logically work together, you're basically, with look-say, you try to identify or remember the word like a pictogram or like an ideogram, and then so you basically have one large stimulus that you're supposed to have an immediate definitional response to, as opposed to if you don't have that response, don't have that definition ready to respond to the stimulus, you can look at it and break down the pieces, and then by breaking down those pieces, you can figure out what the word means. Okay, so that has a reflexive component, because the stimulus response method is meant to bypass thinking, and it's meant to target the reflexes. So I like to say it's a method of teaching what to think instead of how to think. Okay,
that's right.
Yeah, how to think is
good description.
And the how to think is the classical method, of what I call what's been called the trivium. Okay, and it also has a philosophical component to it, which is that there are categories of the mind and there are categories of reality. And the first component of grammar is how you name those categories. The second component of logic, right, has three principles. The first one, identity, is established when you name something. The second one, contradiction or non-contradiction, is when the categories of your mind conform to the categories of reality. Okay, and there's other laws like tautology that you can use to help deduce things. Okay, and then rhetoric is the part where you can actively express that on your feet, right? And you can break down fallacies in the rhetoric of government, corporation, others. You can also weed out the contradictions in your own thought. So this is a philosophy, basically, that that there is an objective truth, right? And that can be found in the non-contradictory relationship between the mind and the observation of the reality or the universe. That's the opposite of the modern conception, which is, it starts with Hegelianism, which is where basically contradictions, right? The classical method says contradictions do not exist, right? And that we weed those out, and truth is non-contradictory. Hegel basically said that truth evolves through contradictions. Okay, so he had this idea of thesis, antithesis, synthesis. So he thought that the world evolved through ideas. Okay, you have one idea, it's a dominant idea called the thesis. The opposite idea is the antithesis or antithesis. These ideas clash. They come to form a new synthesis, right? And this term evolution is actually his. Darwin's the one that takes it in a biological sense. It's really just him that he starts it in an idealist sense. But one of those premises is that truth, therefore, is evolves in contradiction. There is truth in contradiction. Well, if I can just jump ahead without going through all the historical steps, that culminates in something today that is largely called performance identity. Okay, it's a form of deconstructionism. Okay, and it's this idea that it's essentially the simplest way to say it is everything is relative, everything is subjective. Okay, and so the categories of the mind take primacy. There is no categories of reality to fit them to. So basically, you can use this is where all your identity politics come from, because it's all about taking your identity, however you perceive of those categories, and then trying to impose it onto, right, this non-objective world. Okay, and so if you put those two things together, what you have is a state apparatus, because Hegel said that in these contradictions of things like the slave master dialectic, right? He said that even it's an apparent contradiction. Don't worry what the slave tells you. The truth is that there's a synthesis in the order of the state, which he said is God marching on earth. So if the state is God and the school is an apparatus of it, then essentially what they're doing is they're conditioning. You're going to use the psychological method to condition your reflexes to conform the categories of your mind to whatever is the state apparatus, not to the objective reality of truth, and to point out the contradictions between that and what the state tells you, or what the corporations tell you, or what whoever tells you. And so you lay those two things together, and that's what you have now. And it evolves into the modern adaptive learning software through B.F. Skinner. Okay, so B.F. Skinner came up with operant conditioning. It's just a fancy term for the behaviorist psychology, which is just another version of the stimulus response stuff that Wilhelm Wundt came up with first. He's the founder of laboratory psychology. He comes up with this idea that he wanted, psychology actually means the study of the soul, but he's like, you can't get to the essence of a person, but you can infer it based on behaviors, and you can therefore control the essence through the behavior, and you can control the behavior by controlling the environment, the environmental stimuli. Okay, and so the classical example in classical conditioning is Pavlov's dog. Okay, you have a natural stimulus, which is the food, and it creates a natural response, which is the dog salivates. You can associate it with an artificial stimuli, which is the bell. Okay, and then over time you can condition the dog to have a reflex to the bell without the food, to salivate. Basically, later the behaviorists they make it a little more complex by putting dogs and putting these animals in mazes and trying to see if they can condition particular behavioral patterns. B.F. Skinner puts scheduling on it, puts 4 quadrants of positive and negative reward and punishment, and then he puts that into something called this teaching machine. You can find pictures of it on Smithsonian's website. It's what later becomes today the adaptive learning software that everybody's being forced to use right now, and that is essentially this. The window is the stimulus. Whatever your answer to the stimulus is the response. So in the window, you've got something like a question. Maybe it's a video. Maybe it's a diagram. And then your response is either multiple choice, short answer, some kind of performance project. And then based on your response, the adaptive learning software is going to either give you, if you're fast and good at it, it's going to give you something more challenging, maybe push you towards more academic stuff. If you're slow at it, not very good at it, it's going to remediate you and probably put you on a career pathway, like a vocational ed track. Okay, Skinner had this set up with an analog with this box. Basically, it looked like the old Viewmasters, if you remember those things with, they had like the Disney pictures in them. You put the wheel in, it's got goggles. You pull click the button, and the wheel turns, and every time it turns, you see a different scene. Well, put that on switch it to a box. Instead of pictures on the wheel of tape, you have questions. That's the stimulus. You turn the knob, you pencil in your answer. That's the response. Can only go one direction, so as once you answer it, it's basically scoring you. Actually, some of them he had designed where they would distribute chocolate and things as rewards if you had a good answer. So there's the other part, the reinforcement part, and you basically just take those gears and wheels and you turn them into digital windows and clicks with a mouse, and that's what we have now. And except that now they've automated it with these adaptive adaptive learning algorithms. And so this is the cognitive behavioral part of it, and it ties into the DNA part we talked about earlier, and then the socio-emotional part we can talk about in a second. Aggregate all that stuff together, and you get a psychological profile on the student that they can plug into their social credit score with or without a chip that we talked about, which I see, they're going to try eventually one way or another. But that's essentially how the cognitive behavioral conditioning connects to the eugenics part in the artificial intelligence that they. I should mention too that there's they just passed some federal regulations, new federal rules. You can comment on them publicly until 5/4. It's 85 FR 18638. Basically, what it's doing is it's going to it got a bunch of requirements to fund the adaptive learning software, and so basically what they're doing is I've never taught online until now, and part of that is because you got to have a special certificate to do it. And then the modules that you build have to meet certain standards, just like our syllabi have to meet certain standards. So that's one loophole they gave us. And then the other one has to do with funding. So when they give federal dollars to a school, one of the things they have to look at is the student making progress towards completion? That's why they harp on you about your 10-day attendance and your midterm attendance. And if you don't turn in your 10-day attendance, you've messed up the money flow. And if the student doesn't come by 10 days and you mark him or her absent, what happens is you don't get the money for that student. Okay. Same thing at midterm. If midterm, if you don't mark it, they're going to get less money. So when you do the adaptive learning software through these online companies like K-12 Inc., which was set up by Secretary of Education Bill Bennett, okay, and it's basically just building on Secretary of Education T.H. Bell's ideas like Project BEST, which was leaked by Charlotte Thompson Iserby. It means better education skills through technology. It's all about this stimulus. It's basically was the plan in the 80s to do what they're doing now, which is put the Skinner box in there, okay? And these online companies like K-12 Inc., KIP, and stuff like that, they can go on a subscription basis. Okay, so instead of you have 16 weeks for the course material, by the end of it, you got to be done, and you have to keep up with it, and then you get your credits, your credit hours. What they're going to do now for some of these companies is you have so many modules to complete. If you're fast, you can complete it faster than a normal 16-week class. If you're slow, you can take a year, 2 years, okay, as long as you pay your monthly fee. And so they weren't able to get federal dollars before because there was no way to really measure that. And now this bill is going to let them take federal grant money to basically, skirt the what they call active engagement.
Yeah, and once they take the federal grant money, there are strings attached to that money. They then have to comply with this new, transformative eugenic type program that you're talking about. I mean, it's basically. And also, I mean, look, there's so much here that we can unwrap, and you've put out some really, really good and important information. The only thing I might add at this point is that Hegel developed the dialectic, as you say, but he also developed, as you say, the idea of the superstate, and that the replacing belief in God or a creator of the universe, a divine being, with the state becomes God. And this really started in a way with Martin Luther, but I mean, Hegel brought it up to a high art, and it continued on from there. I mean, Oswald Spengler, an English philosopher, believed that the state had an organic life. It was born, it would have adolescence and a full flowering, and then a decline and a death, and that the state becomes like a person. The state becomes like a worshipped ideal. And if people don't believe me, look at what the left believes about the state. They want the government to run education, healthcare, welfare, every aspect of our lives. And they don't want it to be a democratic state in the sense that it's elected officials operating in a constitution. They want appointed experts, the so-called enlightened ones, to run everything. And it is and the only way to do that is to remove God. Ultimately. Now, that doesn't mean Hegel was an atheist. He wasn't, but his followers developed that way, including Karl Marx. So anyway, bringing it up to the present, we now have them, utilizing the powers of the cyberspace to further implement this. how do we combat that as parents, as children? How do we debug ourselves and protect ourselves from this whole agenda?
Well, so I had a 5-point plan. I had 5 points of solutions, as much as I could simplify it as I could make it. Right? And so I'll throw them out, and maybe we'll dive into a few of them. We kind of touched on a couple of them already.
Sure.
So the first one is, to try to maintain public control and local control. Okay, so I mean, if you want to have any say, I mean, save your elected school boards. Okay, one of the outcomes when you start charter schooling or taking vouchers or tax credits for savings accounts, or right, you start to bring in your online private software, whatever, and then you take the federal money. Now it's public-private. Okay, and what that means is
you've sold out. Yeah, you've sold out, and it's very difficult not to, because they take the money out of us in the form of taxes, and then they give it back to us with strings attached. It's hard for a local school, a school board, and for a local community to be really sovereign and to really respond to the wishes and interests of their own children and their own students and their own citizens, because they get caught up in this mammoth system which basically controls them, like with cords, with all these strings attached. They take the money that they need, and then they have to fulfill all these different things that have very nefarious agendas connected to them.
And that's the stimulus response. That's the behaviorist method, right? The carrot and the stick, the reward and the punishment. They call them tax incentives and penalties, right? And we're not forcing you, but over time, it's going to be very difficult to not
exactly.
comply.
You get caught up in it, just like it's like getting stuck in a spider web. But I mean, I don't know. One of the solutions that occurs to me right offhand is obvious, and that's homeschooling. And I think that this one of the good things that might come out of this whole COVID hoax is the fact that people are going to start to school their own children. Sam Blumenfeld, the late Sam Blumenfeld, my dear friend and one of my mentors, he was all over that. He'd be all over this thing if he were alive today. He was one of the founders of the modern homeschooling movement. And homeschooling means you can impart your values to your children without this external control. You decide which type of education. If you want to be progressive and left and all that, that's fine too. There's something for everyone in homeschooling.
I agree. The only thing I worry about happening is that, especially now, is that they're going to try to make where you have to have the software for them to recognize that your little boy or little girl has a certificate that can go on to the next grade, higher ed, however they restructure the whole, there's
I get it.
Lifelong learning, which
no, that has to be resisted.
And so I mean, I'm totally for a classical education at home with books, without digital. I mean, you could skip past my second point, which is, abolish the psych conditioning methods in the classroom, and the third point, which is, digital privacy for the extent that you want to use these devices. But no, I mean, my solutions my last two solutions are to go back to the classical trivium method, and then also to teach things like transcendent values, a priori values. I mean, and whether you at the homeschool, you can do it, you can call it God, and you can call it whatever is your interpretation. But I tried to do it because I'm a public educator, so I tried to do what I could do to maintain or to save public schools, or what is good or good left of it. And I tried to come up with a way, kind of like Adler's great books type thing.
They're great.
But also grounded in an idea of, objective reality, objective truths, objective, they don't like the word morals, but, that's what it is,
Exactly.
ethics. And we can have debates. Yeah, about all the different ancient interpretations of it. The Greeks had the Logos, the Chinese had the Tao, the Hindus had the Urta, Persians had the Asha, Buddhists had Dharma, and even someone like Kant, who believed in God, he tried to come up with a way you could get there largely by means of reason and inference. So, I mean, even people that want to be agnostic or even atheist or something, I think there's a way we can agree that there has to be objective truths, objective morals that transcend, the latest empirical algorithm. I mean, that's the opposite of what we have right now. And I've said this before on a few other shows, which is that they basically want the algorithm to be God. Okay, another clause in that bill, that there's new federal proposed rules. I would have had the quota, but I was having problems with the connections last time. I'll paraphrase it. It essentially says this, and you can go on and read the bill. It says that these algorithms evolve faster than we can regulate. And so we don't want to get in the way of progress. We're not going to sanction schools that move forward with new tech innovations that we have not yet regulated or otherwise, had any oversight on. And so what that means, though, then is you're putting the algorithms in charge of education. You're putting the algorithms in charge of the future of how we're going to go forward with learning. Well, you can extrapolate that out into the larger sphere because, if these algorithms supposedly can teach better than me, then that means that robots have not only replaced physical labor, they've replaced intellectual labor. And if they've replaced intellectual labor, then your thoughts, you basically cannot question them, right? Because by definition, these things are smarter than you, so you have no basis to question. So they become a god. They become a type of god, an unquestioning basis for what you have to believe is truth. And then people like the medical eugenic class, I'll just say someone like Fauci tonight, would like you to believe that he's the priest class and that the models or the algorithms are the transcendent truth that you can't question. And if they can tell you that whether you believe in God or not, whether you go to church or not, if they can tell people that church is not an essential service, the place where those people go to find their moral truths in a time of not just financial crisis and health crisis, but it's going to be moral and ethical crisis as people get more stressed out. If you're saying that church is a non-essential service, you're saying that God is a non-essential service. You're also saying that transcendent morality is a non-essential service, which means that you're declaring yourself to be God and the transcendent law. And, I would like to think that even atheists and agnostics who don't believe in God or some transcendent truth would at least agree that they would not like to provide, to vest that power in any human or institution either, right? And so I think we can agree that there's got to be, we might not be able to ever articulate and define it as something that we can, totally legislate, but that's the idea of it being transcendent, right? That we all have an equal access to it as long as we, base it on the golden rule.
Exactly. These are universal themes. And I think that you lay out a very good agenda for how to resist this thing, how to inoculate yourself, if you will, against this sort of thing, and that you identify what this is in a very good way in your book. So anyway, John, but we're kind of reaching toward the end of the show, so I'd like you to let my viewers and listeners know how they can get more information about you and your book.
Oh, thanks. Yeah. So I got a website that's schoolworldorder.info. And, I was never plugged into all this data stuff. I literally just now opened my very first social media account after all these years. And it was literally right before the coronavirus started. It was like, hey, what a time to jump in here.
Well, when it's used properly, it's fascinating. I mean, but it has to be, you have to kind of know who you are and what you're doing with it.
Oh, yeah, no. And I very soon learned that. I was like, oh, wow, there's most of what people are posting, or at least the people that I follow, is like news. Like it's news articles that I wouldn't otherwise. So I was like, oh, that's pretty cool. So mine is largely, a thread of research or other posts that I fit into my research. And it's at Taoist Professor. That's Tao with a T, Taoist Professor. And so it's Taoist Professor at Taoist Professor. I don't know how. Sometimes you're supposed to leave off the at. I'm totally green when. No,
I think that's the address I have for you. So I'll be able to post that on the YouTube channel when I post this show.
Oh yeah, and my email is taoistprofessor@gmail.com. But yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Will do. All right, listen, John, I want to thank you for joining me. Really interesting talk.
Thanks for having me, Charles.
My pleasure. And have a great afternoon. Thanks a lot.
Thanks much.